I have been a leader on IVF, which is fertilization. The IVF, I have been a leader. In fact, when they got a very negative decision on IVF from the Alabama courts, I saw the people of Alabama and the legislature 2 days later voted it in. I've been a leader on it. They know that, and everybody else knows it. I have been a leader on fertilization, IVF.
It's been a week since Donald Trump made that instantly classic proclamation. I've been a leader on fertilization. Of course, everyone who pays any attention to the issue of reproductive rights knows that it's Trump's party that has been mobilizing against in vitro fertilization. Indeed, it was Trump's handpicked MAGA Supreme Court that paved the way for IVF to be threatened in the first place, as it was in Alabama, when that court overturned Roe v. Wade. Now, there is an actual way to fix this problem. You could just pass a law in Congress, signed by the president, protecting access to IVF. It's something Democrats have actually been trying to do all year. In fact, today, the Senate once again took a vote on protecting in vitro fertilization at the federal level. But the leader on fertilization, who we should note is never shy about forcing his Republicans to support a kill a bill, he was nowhere to be found. Didn't say a single thing on it. And guess what? Oh, look at that. The measure was rejected by all but 2 Republicans. Trump's vice presidential candidate, Senator J.D. Vance of Ohio, who is so committed to this issue, didn't even bother to show up to vote. Senator LaFonza Butler is a Democrat of California. She voted to protect IVF access today, and she joins me now. I guess the result was not surprising today, Senator, although I did wonder after the leader of the Republican Party staked out this claim that he was a leader in IVF. He even talked about federal support, mandating insurance companies that he would whip votes on this, that they would, I mean, nothing changed.
Chris, thanks for having me. And, unfortunately, nothing changed. As we've heard the same tired old stories from Donald Trump, the concepts of his plans for the American people here, they had an opportunity. The Republican Party had an opportunity to actually put action behind their words. And you and I both know the leaders lead. And the way in which President Trump rallied Republican voters with just Republican senators with just a tweet to tank the border security legislation, he didn't say a word. He didn't even tweet or utilize, Truth Social to communicate his views or direction that he would give to Republican senators. And we ended up in the exact same place that the American people were before, with their rights and freedoms to make decisions about their own bodies, to expand their families, exactly where we were prior to today's vote. And it's shameful. And the American people shouldn't believe a word he says.
I think one of the things that's a little gaslighty about this whole thing is Republicans keep saying, like, we love IVF. What are you talking about? Like, there's nothing here, and then voting to block it. And I think the reality underneath that, and I'm curious if this is how you see it from the Senate, is that there is a large faction of the Republican Party and conservative movement who believes that a fertilized egg is a person with the full rights under the Constitution of you or I, and that in vitro fertilization is as bad as killing a person, that every fertilized embryo is a right, and that the whole process is wrong and should be made illegal. Those people exist, and they do wield power in the Republican Party, which seems to me the reason you're getting these no votes, unless I'm misreading the situation.
Chris, you're reading it exactly right. That is exactly how the Alabama legislature wound up in a position to have to affirmatively protect IVF in their state laws, because their state Supreme Court had that exact interpretation because of laws that had been passed years prior, doing that exact thing, saying that a fertilized embryo had the same rights, and destroying a fertilized embryo was consistent with murder. And so here is where we find ourselves. They have painted this picture and sort of gone down this road of defying the American people, the ability to make decisions about their own body for decades. And now that the MAGA Supreme Court has ripped away the rights of Roe, the emperor has no clothes. It is truly clear their intention to control the decisions of women and their bodies in this country. And there's no turning back. And so they've tried to hide and bend and shapeshift every position at every opportunity. And today, in the United States Senate, they had the opportunity to make it clear to the American people that they stand with them and their right to make these decisions and to advance their families. And we now know exactly what they believe.
You have known Vice President Kamala Harris for a long time. You knew her when she was a senator. You've known her in California for a very long time. You know her very well, both as a politician and as a person. And I'm just curious, as someone who has known her for a long time, what are you making of all this? Like, watching someone that you know as well as you know the vice president put in a position to perform at the level that she has to perform at, and so far doing that. What do you think?
Look, if this were an Olympic Games, she'd be sticking the landing. She is doing outstanding, and I am not surprised. I have seen her leadership up close and personal in good times and in bad, making decisions every single day on behalf of the American people. It is, and I'm not surprised, Chris, because it is exactly who she is. And she has been that way, a fearless fighter for the people her entire career. And it really is does my heart proud. But most importantly, I think, you know, for the American people to get the opportunity to get to know her in the way that many of us who have known her for a long time really is speaks to the kind of leadership that our country needs in this moment. And for all of those Kamala curious voters out there, she's doing a great job extending an invitation to build a new way forward for this country and unite us as a people. And I'm proud to be able to do it with her.
California Senator Laphonza Butler, thank you very much for your time tonight. Appreciate it.
That was the demolition of the Trump Plaza Hotel and Casino in Atlantic City back in 2021. And if you know anything about the story of Trump and his casino businesses, I bet you know that the story does not end well. Multiple Trump casinos ended up filing for bankruptcy. That much I bet you already knew, but you probably don't know this story. The year was 1982, the first year that Forbes magazine published its list of the 400 richest Americans. Donald Trump made the list, claiming he was worth $100 million. But at the time, Trump was really only worth about $5 million, and he was also hemorrhaging cash. But Donald Trump had a plan. That year, Trump got a license from the New Jersey Casino Control Commission to operate a casino in Atlantic City, New Jersey. And Trump found an investor to help him finance the project. Holiday Inn, which owned the casino chain Harrah's, would give Trump $50 million in cash to build the casino, and then Trump and Harrah's would split the profits. Trump had to just prove one little thing first. Here is how the New York Times investigative reporters Suzanne Craig and Russ Buettner tell the story in their new book, Lucky Loser. Donald was on the verge of a great deal, one that would also get him out of a bind. Before leaving, the CEO of Holiday Inn told Donald that his board of directors would want to see with their own eyes that construction on the casino was underway, evidence that this young builder could make this happen. Donald kept the truth to himself. He did not have things underway because he did not have the money. So he directed his construction supervisor to hire every piece of earth-moving machinery he could find. The day the Holiday Inn board visited the site, dozens of bulldozers and backhoes pointlessly pushed mounds of earth around the 2.6-acre site in an elaborate ruse with no purpose other than to fool Trump's new business partner. Afterwards, Trump introduced himself to one of the Holiday Inn executives with the line he would never forget: "I think I'm probably the most successful person my age in the United States." That was how Trump started the Trump Plaza Hotel and Casino. He bluffed his way into it. Trump created the myth of himself as a successful businessman, and he sold it to the public so that he could then sell it to his business partners. And for a long time, that myth really worked out.
there is a new billionaire in town. Trump's the name. Donald Trump is a major deal maker, a swashbuckler.
Today, a lot of this country still believes that myth, and Donald Trump is still cashing in on it. It is not just Donald Trump, the Republican nominee, who is having a busy week. Donald Trump, the businessman, also has a lot on his plate. There's his new cryptocurrency venture and the possible sale of his shares of Trump Media, the parent company of Truth Social. But as New York Times reporters Suzanne Craig and Russ Buettner point out in their deeply reported new book about Trump's wealth, Trump's successes aren't the result of shrewd business acumen. They are the result of many, many, many lucky breaks. Good things happened to Donald Trump. He did not earn most of those good things. He was born. He was discovered by a revolutionary television producer, and he was pushed into an investment against his will. And from those 3 bits of good luck came the equivalent today of more than $1.5 billion. That sort of tailwind could paper over a litany of failure and still fund a lavish life. And there is no evidence that in 50 years of labor, Donald Trump added to his lucky fortunes. He would have been better off betting on the stock market than on himself. Joining me now are Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times investigative reporters Suzanne Craig and Russ Buettner, authors of Lucky Loser, How Donald Trump Squandered His Father's Fortune and Created the Illusion of Success. Congratulations, guys, on this exhaustive, really, delicious read. I shouldn't say it like that, but filled with a lot of new reporting and some deeply informative reporting on stories we sort of knew. I want to talk first about, because the word father is in the subhead of the book. Maybe Suzanne, you can start first. Just the relationship between Donald Trump and Fred Trump was more beneficial to Donald Trump than I think people even imagine, right? He's prone these days to calling him his Brooklyn builder of a dad, but the reality is he's the money man behind Donald Trump's entire fortune. Can you talk a little bit about it?
I think we'd all, in some ways, like to have a father like
in some ways,
Trump.
In all ways. I think just throwing millions of dollars.
A lot of money, yeah. Donald Trump definitely benefited from his relationship with his father when it comes to the finances. He was born into an incredibly wealthy family. I just remember one of the stories that I was thinking about the family, and they grew up in Queens, and all the kids in the neighborhood used to marvel at the fact they had an electric door opener for the garage. Like, they had everything. They had the first color TV, and he really, he grew up very, very wealthy, and he inherited a lot of money. And we've written about the fact that he inherited it, and it was enhanced by tax fraud. But that was really the first hugely lucky break of his life. And he has spent so much time talking about how his father, he's really a small-time guy, nothing to look at here.
Never could have made the fortune that Trump did.
No. Small-time guy gave him a very small loan, and Donald Trump did it all on himself. It was as if he was robbed of a hard-scrabble story, and he had to come up with one. It's incredible just how he has gone out of his way. First, we see in his early business career that he appropriates his father's wealth. We see news stories where he says he's worth $200 million. It grows to $1 billion. He's appropriating his father's wealth. And then he spends a lot of his life diminishing his father's accomplishments. Fred Trump, Donald became a black hole for Fred's money eventually.
And Fred Trump abides this smack talking from his chosen son, right? Not only does he single out Trump, of the 5 Trump kids, Donald is the chosen one, and he allows Trump, his son, to basically diminish his legacy and suggest that he's some kind of mastermind, when really the inverse is true, is it not?
It really is, and I think that's one of the most remarkable parts of this as a long story, right? That's a thread that weaves through decades of this thing. Fred has done everything pretty much he's broken rules, but as a businessman, he follows very strict procedures. He always estimates correctly what his revenue is going to be. He doesn't spend more than that's going to take in. All his projects make money. He's very careful. Donald is just the opposite sort. But when Donald first arrives in about 1968, he immediately starts taking over the business. He becomes the public spokesperson for it. This fellow, John Barron, becomes the public spokesperson for it. Right. And Donald starts announcing that they're building projects all over the place, that they're going to build a new seaport in Lower Manhattan. They're going to build a convention center in D.C. They're going to do all these things. And it's all smoke and mirrors. None of it happens. Fred's never done that in his life, but he like goes along for the ride. And when Donald does get a project up, when he gets his first sort of building up, Donald starts telling the world that he has fully taken over the finances of his father's company. He has not. But Fred goes along with that and allows Donald to say, and echoes it, that Donald has surpassed me, when Donald literally had one building up of his own. It's really just a remarkable relationship that's very central to what he was able to accomplish.
And setting in motion what would become a long career of diminishing people closest to him who support him and assuming that their loyalty is inviolable.
And casting them overboard when they're not loyal.
What is staggering to a lot of folks who remember Trump in the 80s and 90s is that even in the Apprentice years, it's like completely castles built. It's a paper tiger, right? The Apprentice offices or the offices that the Apprentice is going to film in are so shabby that they have to kind of use smoke and mirror. Can you talk a little bit about the stagecraft of pretending that Donald Trump is actually a successful businessman?
There was a lot of stagecraft involved when Mark Burnett showed up at the offices and his producers. They came in thinking that they were going to be casting a billionaire. And keep in mind, Donald Trump was the host of the show. He was the prize that all these contestants wanted. They were vying and they were scheming to work for. And the producers showed up and they found chipped furniture and they said the carpet smelled. They just said it was awful. So they ended up creating a whole nother area on the fourth floor of Trump Tower, partly for where the contestants would live, but the whole boardroom was fake. That was not Donald Trump's boardroom. They had to recreate the whole thing.
The one thing that escapes me is, given the fact that this guy is hemorrhaging cash, he's going into deals, he's being bailed out by other investors who then are brought in, he continues to sell himself publicly as a businessman. Nobody pipes up. I mean, here we are looking today at the potential sale of Trump Social stock, which is largely built on Donald Trump's reputation and not at all on Truth Social's ability to generate revenue. Do you have a working thesis about how he's able to convince people over and over and over and over again?
I think there's a couple of things you have to give him credit for. He has this innate charisma that's followed him his entire life. In every aspect, every era of his life that we look into, there were people that were wooed by him. But also, he can be incredibly persuasive. And not just people who you think are easily persuaded. Throughout this book, there are people who are very smart and very accomplished who give him opportunities to do something when he hasn't done it before because he convinced them that he could. That has been a diminishing trend over the last 10 years, right? The things that once he got the money from The Apprentice, he decided again to undertake this effort to make himself look like a businessman by starting businesses. So he built a huge tower in Chicago. He secretly declared it completely worthless on his tax returns after he got it open. He remodeled the old post office into a hotel in D.C. He lost $7 to $10 million every year, and he had to sell that. He bought some golf courses in the UK. They all were sucking money, and he had to subsidize them with this money from his fame. So, he's not really convincing people much anymore, but now he's got this new audience, which are his political followers. And I really think Truth Social is marketing to them.
Right.
Yeah.
He's selling their persecution complex to them. And if you look at the site and read the people who invested, that's the thing that they grab onto, is we're under assault from all sides. We have to protect this site. We have to protect Donald Trump. He's our only chance.
Yeah, he was once monetizing the sort of Trump brand and this gilded 80s, 90s New York. Now he's monetizing grievance and rage. Really, you have to hand it to him in terms of the innovation on that front.
But we begin tonight with a visit to the Upside Down, because it is only there that Donald Trump may be able to get away with attempting to lay the blame for the violent state of our politics at the feet of Vice President Kamala Harris and the Democrats. If Merriam-Webster was looking for a new example to help define the term gaslighting, they should look no further than Trump's claim that the latest apparent assassination attempt against him is a direct result of the, quote, highly inflammatory language from the other side. And following that claim, in his next breath, he goes on to use that same inflammatory language against them, saying, quote, these are people that want to destroy our country. It is called the enemy from within. They are the real threat. It's as if Trump believes that we all have a collective case of amnesia from, well, his entire lifetime of using that rhetoric against anyone and everyone who even looks at him the wrong way. As the New York Times' Peter Baker writes, Trump is at the heart of today's eruption of political violence. reminding readers that he has long favored the language of violence in his political discourse, encouraging supporters to beat up hecklers, threatening to shoot looters and undocumented migrants, mocking a near-fatal attack on the husband of the Democratic House Speaker, and suggesting that a general he deemed disloyal be executed. While Trump's running mate J.D. Vance really tried hard yesterday to make his new boss proud by making the case against the other side. We thought, we'd provide the receipts to James David about just who needs to tone down the incitement based on his high standards.
I do think that we should take this opportunity to call for a reduction in the ridiculous and inflammatory political rhetoric coming from too many corners of our politics.
If Comrade Kamala Harris gets 4 more years, you will be living a full-blown banana republic ruled by an anarchy and a tyranny. It's the people that surround her. They're scum. They're scum. And they want to take down our country. They are absolute garbage.
But the big difference between conservatives and liberals is that no one has tried to kill Kamala Harris in the last couple of months.
A Virginia man was arrested on Friday and charged with threatening to kill Vice President Kamala Harris.
Federal authorities have charged a man from Memphis with making death threats against President Biden and Vice President Harris.
We can debate one another, but we cannot tell the American people that one candidate is a fascist, and if he's elected, it is going to be the end of American democracy.
There's a radical left, Marxist, communist, fascist. Comrade is the best because it says he's a Marxist, communist, fascist person, she's a fascist. She's a threat to democracy. If she ever got elected, she'd change it, and it will be the end of our country.
Yes, the sweet smell of receipts. But the height of J.D. Vance's hypocrisy is his inability to take any responsibility for the pain and fear he has subjected his own constituents to. Lies about the town of Springfield, Ohio, and its Haitian immigrant community that have had real and frightening consequences. Today, children, little kids, elementary schoolers, entered school under the watchful eye of Ohio state troopers who are stationed across all 17 buildings of the Springfield School District on the orders of Ohio Governor Mike DeWine. DeWine said Monday that at least 33 bomb threats have been made in Springfield since the lies about the city and Haitian immigrants were pushed by Trump and Vance. DeWine said the threats have been investigated and found to be hoaxes, but that doesn't absolve the people who have amplified, or in their own words, created these stories from what they have foisted upon this town. One Haitian immigrant who has lived in Springfield for 5 years told USA Today that the community feels targeted. Quote, "You can see it's pure hatred. They hate us." Meanwhile, Donald Trump is threatening to visit Springfield, Ohio soon. Though today, Springfield's mayor said a Trump visit would put an extreme strain on the town's resources.
We did not have threats 7 days ago. We did not have these concerns 7 days ago. We do today. We'd like those that on the national stage that can bring peace, that could tamper their words and speak truth. That's what Springfield is asking.
Joining me now is David Jolly, former Republican congressman and MSNBC political analyst, and Jason Johnson, professor of politics and journalism at Morgan State University and an MSNBC political contributor. I'm going to start with David, since you have the disadvantage of not being here with us in the studio. Donald Trump is beyond all of that. And I didn't even include the fact that it is J.D. Vance who called him maybe Hitler. That is J.D. Vance who said that Trump may be Hitler. But that's not even in that little montage. But here's Trump today trying to blame what happened to him in Palm Beach, Florida on, you guessed it, the radical left.
Well, there's a lot of rhetoric going on. A lot of people think that the Democrats, when they talk about threat to democracy and all of this, and it seems that both of these people were radical lefts.
Yeah, here's the problem, David. Thomas Crooks, the Butler, Pennsylvania shooter, was a registered Republican. Ryan Wesley Routh from Florida voted for Donald Trump in 2016 and then said he came to regret it. But these are both Republicans. Your thoughts?
Yeah, Joy, this is a week where I think the media has to take responsibility for having some very hard conversations. We understand the sensitivities around the second apparent assassination attempt of Donald Trump, but they don't get to rewrite history or rewrite facts. And you notice both J.D. Vance and Donald Trump use the word rhetoric, violent rhetoric. Rhetoric is language that lacks meaningful content. So when Donald Trump reaches for imagery of calling Vice President Harris communist or Marxist or socialist, or when he tells white rural America, they're coming for your way of life, or when J.D. Vance says, your side tried to kill our side, that's rhetoric because it's lacking any meaningful content. When the left says Donald Trump is a threat to democracy, he is, factually. Donald Trump incited violence on January 6th to try to overturn an election. We saw that and we heard his words. We saw the people trying to hang Mike Pence. We saw the storming of the Capitol encouraged by Donald Trump. We heard the phone call to the Georgia Secretary of State where he tried to overturn the votes. He has been indicted criminally in federal court under the charge of conspiracy to defraud the United States, conspiracy to defraud the U.S. voters, conspiracy to deny rights. Those are actual threats to the democracy. I realize the language sounds harsh, but this is where it's responsible and incumbent on us this week to actually stay true to the facts. Nobody cares how J.D. Vance wants to frame this. He is playing the role of patsy right now for Donald Trump. The only person who wants to hear another word from J.D. Vance is J.D. Vance, because all he is doing is continuing to spread misinformation this week.
Indeed. And Jason, I mean, there is just an also additional fact. It is the right-wing Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, Three Percenters, Boogaloo Boys who are actually posing the greatest threat to democracy. And that's not me. That's the FBI. The Anti-Defamation League has a report, Murder and Extremism in the U.S. in 2023. All of the extremist-related murders in 2023 were committed by right-wing extremists, not the radical left, the radical right. 88% of killings were tied to white supremacist ideologies. 94% of extremist murders involved a firearm, and it is neo-Nazis who initially started the rumors about Haitians in Ohio. So J.D. Vance might want to look to the people he hangs around with, including blurbing a book called Unhumans and being white nationalist curious for the source of the problems.
This is a campaign strategy. And that's what makes it the most disgusting. The only reason that we're hearing about this now is because Donald Trump believes that the only way he can win this election, and J.D. Vance, who has no soul and no spine, I said he's the Ted Cruz of Ohio. Nobody really likes him. And it's a desperate attempt to rouse up angry white people because that's the only way they can win. And what I think everybody needs to understand, what I think Vice President Harris understands, what I think Tim Walz understands, what I think National Security, FBI, and now the mayor of a small town in Ohio understand, is that these people spark terrorism. There's an entire town in America right now. We're 50 days from an election that's living in fear because of the words that come out of Donald Trump's mouth. There is no excuse for this. There's no explanation for it that can be dressed up. But we shouldn't be shocked because this is a man who is incapable of any level of accountability. Remember, during the debate, he said that January 6th was Nancy Pelosi and the mayor's fault.
Right.
It was Nancy Pelosi's fault that he galvanized hundreds of people to march upon the Capitol and try to hang his vice president. So I'm not surprised by any of this. I think the campaign rhetoric is disgusting. I think it is intentional. I think the most important thing that all Americans can do at this particular point, besides what some of the people in Springfield are doing, which is supporting their local community, is recognizing this rhetoric for what it is and not repeating it, not galvanizing it, not respecting any of the people who sang it, and not pretending that this is part of some policy discussion. They didn't want to talk about policy. They want to talk about hate, and that's what we have to remember.
Let me play Vice President Harris. You mentioned her. This was her comments today about Springfield at the NABJ conference.
There were children, elementary school children, who it was school photo day, who were dressed up in their best, got all ready, knew what they were going to wear the night before, and had to be evacuated. Children. A whole community put in fear. It's a crying shame, literally. What's happening to those families, those children in that community, and spewing lies that are grounded in tropes that are age old.
David Dolly, you've got young kids. You know, the idea that little kids in Springfield, Ohio can't go to school without armed guards surrounding them is J.D. Vance's fault. And he represents them in the United States Senate. There's an election coming up in which his name will be on the ballot, and he will be being asked to be elevated to the vice presidency of the United States after doing that to children in his own state. And they expect Republicans, particularly white Republicans, to vote for him and in the Senate race against Sherrod Brown. Should we expect better of the voters in Ohio that they will not do that? Right now, Trump is leading in that state. But if they go along with it and vote for him, then what does that say about the Republican voter base?
Yeah, this is a horrific moment for this campaign and for the country, and it was incited by J.D. Vance and Laura Loomer and Donald Trump and others. And I think, you know, I believe it was last week you and I discussed the emerging Willie Horton narrative that Donald Trump and J.D. Vance would lay down.
Some House Democrats are bracing for what could happen on January 6, 2025, if Vice President Harris defeats Donald Trump and Republicans keep their House majority. Politico reporting that while many Democrats hope to flip the House, others fear that might not happen. And they're very concerned that Speaker Mike Johnson, who essentially led House Republicans in asking the Supreme Court to overturn the 2020 election, would now be in a position to obstruct the next one. For more, I want to bring in two experts. Retired Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel Amy McGrath. She's a former U.S. Senate candidate and founder of the Democratic Majority Action PAC. And Mike Murphy, veteran Republican strategist and co-director of the Center for the Political Future at the University of Southern California. Amy, Politico says that Mike Johnson is dismissing these concerns, saying Democrats, they're just lying to raise money to flip the House. What do you think?
Well, I think Mike Johnson has proven to be a lapdog of Donald Trump. And he's going to try everything. If he has the power again to do it, he'll try everything to, you know, overturn the election. And if it doesn't go Trump's way, that's what I think. And this is why the down ballot races are so important, because we only need 4 seats. Democrats only need 4 seats to flip the House. So we gotta think about that.
Mike, Republicans who are close to Johnson say no. He is not Trump's lapdog. They cite the example that Mike Johnson supports supporting Ukraine. Donald Trump doesn't. That's their evidence that he doesn't just follow Trump. What do you think?
Well, I think it pays to be paranoid when everybody's out to get you. So if I were the Democrats, I'd be prepared too. Although they made some really big rules changes with the Electoral Count Reform Act.
Explain this.
Yeah, so basically the Senate.
While we were all sleeping.
Well, we were all sleeping. The grown-ups got together and probably Mitch McConnell's hideaway office of both parties and said, all right, we got to patch the software here because we're working on 1898 rules where it was all, well, your honor will honor bound you. Now we're in the Trump era, so some of the glue's not there anymore. So they bolted down a lot of procedural stuff. So one is a lot harder to do. Johnson does have a history of monkeying around with some very dubious arguments last time. But I think the bulwarks are there. I think the Dems are half worried about this appropriately, and nobody in politics, 50 days before an election passes up a golden direct mail fundraising opportunity. So I think everybody's kind of right about each other on this.
J.D. Vance and Donald Trump have made it clear. They don't care in terms of Springfield, Ohio, if it's an outright lie about the stealing and eating of animals. They want immigration to be the focus day in and day out. So is there an opportunity for Democrats here to point out the dangerous, baseless, vile lies that they're pushing about Springfield, and at the same time say, but guess what? Springfield, like lots of other communities, has welcomed lots of immigrants legally, and they're at a capacity problem. Let's talk about how we can solve that. Is there a way for Democrats right now to point out the horrible behavior on Trump and Vance's part, but actually say, but there is an issue, and let's start to solve it? Because Trump's doing neither.
Yeah, and I think there is a way for Democrats to do that, and they have to do that because immigration is on people's minds. At the same time, what J.D. Vance has done in lying about his own constituents, hurting the people of his own state. I mean, this man doesn't even deserve to be a U.S. senator, when you do that. And I think it's really important for Democrats to call that out and to make sure that the American people know, hey, these folks were here illegally. They're doing, just as Governor DeWine, the Republican governor of Ohio, has said they're hardworking people who are coming here to fill jobs that needed to be filled. Springfield, Ohio is only about an hour and a half from where I live. And now we have people that have bomb threats because of J.D. Vance. Because of Donald Trump.
Schools in his district are closed down because of it. But despite all the things that he said and the chaos that he caused, here's what he said today when he was talking about attempts to assassinate the former president.
Again, 2 assassination attempts in as many months, and I think that it's time to say to the Democrats, to the media, to everybody that has been attacking this man and trying to censor this man for going on 10 years, cut it out or you're going to get somebody killed.
I've been in politics a long time, about 4 decades, and this guy amazes me. And I thought I've seen it all. I personally know about it because in 2017, J.D. Vance called me up and asked me about running a campaign for U.S. Senate as an anti-Trump Republican. It's
Hold on. Slow this down.
Yeah.
He called you on the phone in 2017.
We got to do something
what?
about this Trump guy. I want to run for Senate in the Republican primary as anti-Trump Republican. And I was anti-Trump. Said, sure, let's do it. Going to be uphill. Probably going to lose. Little did I know that next thing you know, he's looking up Faust on Google and making the master plan here. So I'm stunned by this. It's so corrosive, but I know what the strategy is behind it. He's doing the pro wrestling villain. JD, all of America is going to hate you, but keep repeating this crap because you make everybody talk about it, and it might help Trump net to debate whether or not there are missing schnauzers because of cannibals in Springfield rather than real issues. So there is a method to his madness. There was a famous political scientist named George Lakoff who wrote a great book, Don't Think of an Elephant. So now you're thinking of an elephant. So that's kind of what J.D. Vance is trying to do. He's trying to disrupt the conversation. Everyone's going to hate him, but vice presidents don't deliver the vote. The president does. I don't think it'll work, but that's what they're trying to do here. So he is going to be spewing crazy stuff around the clock. It's outrageous and shameless and even, frankly, Orwellian as it is when he says that it's Democratic speech that caused these tragic attempts on Donald Trump's life. No, it's the coarse political dialogue that we could all do a lot to pull back. But the idea that Trump is without some authorship of the new tone in American politics over the last 5 years is completely nuts.
Please.
The former president handpicked 3 members of the United States Supreme Court with the intention they would undo the protections of Roe v. Wade. They did as he intended, and in state after state, laws have been passed criminalizing health care providers. I don't know if anyone here has heard most recently the stories out of Georgia. A tragic story about a young woman who died because it appears the people who should have given her health care were afraid they'd be criminalized after the Dobbs decision came down.
Hi there, everyone. It's 5 o'clock in New York. Vice President Kamala Harris earlier today speaking to the National Association of Black Journalists on the threat that Donald Trump represents to all women in America if he were to return to the White House. The vice president there was referencing brand new reporting in ProPublica that found that the abortion bans he put into motion aren't just causing women to needlessly suffer while waiting for treatment or inflicting long-term irreversible damage to their health, rendering them infertile or impacting their ability to have children in the future. We now have irrefutable proof that the bans are killing women. ProPublica found that at least 2 women in Georgia have died after being unable to access timely abortion care after Roe was overturned. Here's one woman's story. Quote, in her final hours, Amber Nicole Thurman suffered from a grave infection that her suburban Atlanta hospital was well equipped to treat. But just that summer, her state had made performing the procedure she needed a felony, with few exceptions. Any doctor who violated the new Georgia law could be prosecuted and face up to a decade in prison. Thurman waited in pain in a hospital bed, worried about what would happen to her 6-year-old son as doctors monitored her infection spreading, her blood pressure sinking, and her organs beginning to fail. It took 20 hours for doctors to finally operate. By then, it was too late. Yesterday should have been Amber's 31st birthday. She's a mom. 31 years old. ProPublica reports that the state medical committee that investigated this case, her case, and others in other states, operate on a 2-year lag on the cases they examine, meaning the cases of women who have died since the Dobbs decision are just now starting to come to light, which means that, according to ProPublica, quote, there are almost certainly others. This inexcusable stain on our country, this tragedy, it's part of something once kept deeply hidden from any political discourse. We never knew these stories. And that is the harrowing accounts of women who are or could be our sisters or our daughters, our mothers, or our friends, being denied vital, life-saving health care after Donald Trump's hand-picked Supreme Court justices stripped away the constitutional right to an abortion. And these real-life stories are so raw, so undeniably cruel, so senseless, that Trump's MAGA loyalists are working overtime to change reality, to deflect and distract from the horror that Donald Trump almost single-handedly created. One former Trump staffer, Project 2025 advisor, a guy named John McEntee, has publicly tried to claim that these tragedies aren't happening at all. As we showed you last week, this guy, John McEntee, took to TikTok to claim that stories about women's suffering are made up.
Can someone track down the women Kamala Harris says are bleeding out in parking lots because Roe v. Wade was overturned? Don't hold your breath.
Eating chicken nuggets while being that inhumane is an interesting touch. It seems to have worked. Since we showed you that video on TikTok Friday, it's made its way around the internet, and the comments have been flooded with women sharing stories of being denied vital abortion care. The Independent is reporting that the McEntee video now has more than 17,000 comments, almost all from women sharing their stories of being denied care. Quote, posting stories of being turned away from emergency rooms in agony, bleeding out in parking lots, at home, in public bathrooms, and sometimes for months afterward. Others talk about miscarriages, ectopic pregnancies, losing the ability to have children, and driving across multiple states to get treatment where it is still legal, often while hemorrhaging. Most of the stories appear to involve wanted or planned pregnancies. The deadly reality for women in 2024 in Donald Trump's post-Roe America is where we start the hour with some of our favorite reporters and friends. ProPublica senior editor Ziva Brandstetter is here. She edited that incredible piece of reporting we read from. Also joining us, President of Reproductive Freedom for All, Mini Timuraj, is here, and former Obama White House Policy Director, MSNBC medical contributor, Dr. Kavita Patel is here. You know, Ziva, I wish that guy, what is his name? Johnny McEntee with the fast food fetish. I wish he was right. I actually wish this wasn't real. But tragically it is. Take us through the ProPublica report.
First, thank you for having us on to talk about this important reporting by Kavita Sarana and other journalists at ProPublica. We found that, this is a very real case of a 28-year-old woman who died in a suburban Atlanta hospital from a preventative cause. And, the state committee that is assigned to review these cases found it preventable. There's a simple procedure that could have saved her life, could have stopped the infection growing within her body. And it wasn't performed for 20 hours. We don't know what was in the committee's mind or what was in the doctor's minds, but we do know what the outcome was, Nicole, and that was this 28-year-old woman is dead. She's one of at least 2 women who've died in Georgia in situations that appear related to the ban and that the state committee has found preventable.
Minnie, I don't want to gloss over this one case yet and talk more broadly about our politics, because I think that what Republicans want people to believe is not just that these women don't exist, but that they're a certain kind of woman. Not that they're a mom who may have desperately wanted the baby she was pregnant with. I think it's why Amanda Zarowski is so inconvenient to Republicans. But there's a little boy who lost his mom at 6 because of Donald Trump's criteria for selecting Supreme Court justices, for only wanting people who would overturn Roe. Whatever happens in our politics, nothing undoes that single tragedy for this family and this little boy.
Yeah, look, we knew this was happening. I have a tremendous amount of gratitude to this tough, smart, persistent reporters at ProPublica who finally proved it, right? I mean, we've been collectively gaslit by Republicans for the past 2 years since Dobbs. We've been shouting, women will die, women are likely dying. Now we have the proof. Amber Thurman would be alive today if it wasn't for Donald Trump and Brian Kemp's abortion ban. Brian Kemp signed that bill. Brian Kemp, a governor who has the opportunity with his legislature to move the Reproductive Freedom Act in Georgia to repeal and fix this mess, has shown no indication he's willing to do it. It's important to understand for everybody that there's complicity up and down the policymaking structure, from the Supreme Court to the Fifth Circuit to the Georgia legislature to the Georgia governor's mansion to the White House. They've all conspired and collaborated for women like Amber to die. I cannot say it enough. We did not have to be in this place. We do not have to live like this. We owe it to Amber and the countless number of women whose stories we do not yet know to do something about this.
Dr. Patel, I want to read you more from ProPublica's reporting on how Amber died. Quote, by the time doctors began to operate on Amber, the situation was so dire that doctors started with open abdominal surgery. The OB performed the DNC, but immediately continued with the hysterectomy. During surgery, Thurman's heart stopped. Her mother was praying in the waiting room when one of the doctors approached. Come walk with me, she said. Her mother recalled her daughter's last words before she was wheeled into surgery. They had made no sense coming from a vibrant young woman who seemed to have her whole life ahead of her. Quote, promise me you'll take care of my son. This isn't an account from the 60s. This isn't fiction. This isn't an ad. This is the United States of America post-Dobbs.
Yeah, Nicole, and it gets even worse. Just, again, kudos to ProPublica for bringing this story forward. As Minnie said, we knew these stories were happening. We know this is the tip of the iceberg. And what's troubling, Nicole, is just reading 20 hours. And she was put, just to be clear, this wasn't 20 hours. She came in with no pain, nothing acute. She had an elevated white blood cell count. She had all the signs. In fact, at one point in the documentation, one of the consultants said that she's in septic shock. So this is very clearly doctors who knew what was happening, not just doctors, entire teams. But you can see how much people ask me, Nicole, often, well, won't doctors just do the right thing? At the end of the day, won't they do the right thing? This just shows you how much of an overhang and a shadow. And I just want to give a little perspective. I don't know any of the doctors involved. I know this hospital, but I don't know the doctors. I know probably what the doctors were thinking, and Minnie knows this too. They're thinking, well, if I get arrested and get removed, and I'm the only covering OB for this area, how many other women am I not going to treat? So this is the position that medical professionals have been put in. By the way, just to say something, Amber herself was a medical professional. She was a medical assistant who was going on to learn nursing. So think about all the layers and things she knew that were wrong in order to get her, unfortunately, into not having an orphan child. That's what's even more mind-boggling, Nicole. This is someone who knew the medical system, knew it well enough to go out of state, knew it well enough to know what to say. Even she couldn't get the care she deserved.